Alright guys, thanks for stopping by my channel. My name is John, and today we're going to be breaking down the anatomy of a font. Now most people know the difference between a serif and a sans serif font, or maybe even a block font or a script font, but there's actually a lot more to type than that. A font can be broken down into a bunch of different sections, much like something like the human body is, and actually a lot of the terms used in type are directly from the human body. I find stuff like this super interesting because I'm a total type nerd. It's definitely some information that not a lot of designers know unless you specialize in type. So it's a great way to impress friends or maybe even potential employers someday. The world of fonts is super fascinating, and what you can do with fonts to evoke different emotions or show different styles is super powerful. So hopefully by the end of this video you'll have a better understanding of what the different parts of fonts are and be able to apply them to your designs, whether you're just picking a font from the internet or actually designing your own font. And maybe next time you download a giant font family, you'll be able to pick out the small differences between each different font. As always, if you wouldn't mind leaving a like below for the YouTube algorithm, it would be a massive help to me, or maybe even a comment. And if you're interested in content like this, it would be awesome if you joined this community by subscribing to the channel. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's jump into the meat of the video. So the first section of the anatomy of the font that we're going to take a look at is the leg. The leg is a portion of the letter that extends downward and attaches to the main body of the font with one end of the font free. You can see that here in the K. The next piece of the font we're going to take a look at is the arm. The arm is a portion of the font that extends upward, with one end being free from the font and the other end being attached to the main body of the font. It can have serifs attached at the free end. Next we'll take a look at the ear of the font. The ear of a letter is a portion of the letter that extends off of the top. Usually this occurs in G's, but it does occur in some other letters depending on the font you're using. Okay, let's move on to the shoulder of the font. The shoulder of the font curves downwards and to the right on letters like H, N, and M. Okay, now let's move on to the tail of the font. The tail is a decorative curved descender often found on capital Qs, as well as sometimes Rs and Ks. Depending on the font or who's talking about it, sometimes people refer to the tail occurring in G, J, P, Q, and sometimes Y. Okay, moving on from the tail, let's check out the spine. The spine is found in the letter S, either uppercase or lowercase, and is kind of the main body of the S. It connects the top and the bottom pieces together. Okay, those are the main things that relate to the human body in terms of the anatomy of the font. Now we'll move on to some other parts of the font. The stroke is one of the most important parts of the font. It's a good indication of how bold or thin the font is going to be. The stroke is essentially the main vertical or diagonal line of a letter. Moving on, we'll take a look at the ascenders of type. The ascender is essentially a vertical stroke that extends upwards above the X height. And while we're on the topic of X height, let's jump into that really quick. The X height's pretty important when designing a font. It's not so much a part of the font, more than a measurement. Essentially, the X height determines the size of all the lowercase letters, since it has a very flat top and bottom in most fonts. When designing a font, determining the X height will be one of the first things you do, and will be critical in figuring out what the main look of your font will be, as it'll determine the height of basically all the lowercase letters. And then while we're talking about heights, let's also talk about the cap height. The cap height is very similar to the X height in that it measures the height of all of the uppercase fonts. Typically the cap height is measured from a flat top and bottom letter like in uppercase N or in uppercase X, sometimes even in uppercase E. Okay, now let's move on to the descender of fonts. The descender of font is much like an ascender of fonts in that it dips below the X height, basically the exact opposite of the ascender. The descender is present in letters like G and Q. Alright, now let's take a look at a swash. A swash isn't necessarily present in all fonts. It's really not present in any sans serif fonts. Essentially, a swash is kind of like a bigger, more ornate serif. Sometimes you'll see them on like the top of a capital B. Basically, it's a big tail that comes off of a font. Okay, now let's take a look at the bar. The bar is essentially a horizontal stroke that is found in letters like lowercase f, h, and a. Next we'll take a look at the serif. The serif is pretty much what you might imagine it to be. It's what makes a serif font. It's the little pieces that come off of the bottom of the font that turn it into a serif font rather than a sans serif font. I like to think of them as like little feet on the font. Alright, now let's jump into terminals. So basically when a font doesn't have a serif, but it does have a tail on something like the lowercase t, this is called a terminal. You can see here on this t that it's just a little tail that curves off the bottom of the lowercase t. Bowls are the next part of the font that we're going to look at. A bowl is anything that creates a curved enclosed space. This is usually seen in letters like lowercase b or d, as well as uppercase D and the uppercase B's. Alright, now we're going to take a look at counters, and I don't really understand why they're called counters. Doesn't really make any sense to me, but that aside, the counter is the negative space within an O. I don't know why they wouldn't call it something more familiar like a hole, but that's what they decide to call it. It's called a counter, and that is just the center space of an O. It's also seen in letters like lowercase b, d, basically just like any of the negative space in a curved letter. Next, we'll take a look at stems. A stem is basically the main vertical uprising piece of a letter. If there is no vertical piece of the letter, such as the uppercase A or uppercase V, the first diagonal line is considered the stem. And finally, we'll take a look at links and loops. Links and loops are interesting in that they only really relate to the lowercase g. So the lowercase g is kind of a special letter in a lot of ways because it really has two of its own unique parts in terms of anatomy. The link is what connects the lowercase g from the bottom of the x height to the start of a loop that occurs in some lowercase g's. And now that we're talking about loops, the loop is essentially the loop that is attached to the link and then up into the main body of the g in the x height. And those are the main parts of the anatomy of type. If I missed anything, I would love to hear your comment below and definitely let me know anything that I missed. Like I said, I'm a super big type nerd, so I'm very interested in this stuff and would love to hear from you guys. This video is going to be part of a longer series where we really break down type, and the next video I think I'm going to do about this topic is probably to do with kerning and leading and tracking. But yeah, that pretty much wraps up the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you wouldn't mind leaving a like below, that would be a huge help to the channel, as well as possibly leave a comment or subscribe if you're interested in more content like this. Alright, thanks again for watching. Later.